Wait, NATO just admitted that they were warned that continued expansion would lead to Ukrainian invasion. They did it anyway. So who really caused this war? And why are the media not covering this? Hello there, you 6.6 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this voyage to truth and freedom, where we look at the facts and analyze them and come to conclusions together. Today, we are talking about the extraordinary revelation that NATO have acknowledged that they were warned by Putin's administration that continuing to expand NATO would lead to an invasion of the Ukraine, and yet they did it anyway. This is not simply to say, oh, aren't NATO bad and isn't Russia fantastic? Of course, this is a geopolitical issue. It's not that simple. What we're interested in is why the mainstream media not covering the fact that NATO have acknowledged that they knew that their actions and expansion would lead to this war. Why are we continually told this was an egregious, unprovoked attack? What is the truth behind this war? And why is it that when someone publicly says the quiet part out loud, the legacy media still doesn't cover it? Whose agenda are they pursuing? Is it ours, or do they have a different intention? Let's have a look at this story together. Use our innate wisdom to deduce the truth as one.
President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us.
So it seems that had they been willing to sign a treaty to not expand NATO, this war could have been avoided. So what is the advantage of expanding NATO? That's one question. Secondly, of course, many of you are aware that at the climax or indeed conclusion of the Cold War, pledges were made to not expand NATO into former Soviet territories. We all know this now, don't we? It's not something that's broadly covered because, again, it's not favourable to the preferred narrative. And most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, is why are the legacy media, when reporting on the subject of this ongoing war, this drain and strain on human resources and indeed human life, this decimation of Ukraine, 500,000 people dead so far, why are they not saying, well, of course, NATO have now acknowledged that they were warned that if they continue to expand, then Putin would invade, and they did it anyway. So who caused this war? What is the reason this war is happening? And significantly, how could we end this war?
And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance.
In a sense, when you listen to this speech, it becomes clear that this war has been a long time coming, probably with the membership of each of these former Soviet nations, in the case that they were former members of the Soviet Union. It has encroached further on the agreement not to expand NATO. So it's not like a war that began all of a sudden. It's part of the ebb and flow of history, and perhaps you will agree with people like Jeffrey Sachs that this war has come about to a degree as a result of the unipolar agenda of centralist American interests, because they have an agenda to deplete Russia, because they have an agenda to create a unipolar world where Chinese interests and Russian interests are challenged. They were willing to agitate Russia to the point of war. And the reason I mention that is because, of course, we're continually told this is a humanitarian crisis. Remember what you're supposed to believe. This is what you're supposed to believe. Russia, basically for no reason, started to wage war on Ukraine. It's terrible, it's egregious, Putin is the new Hitler. And again, this is not to advocate for Putin, it's not to advocate for the actions of Russia. This is simply to say, if the intention, the aim, the goal was to end war, these are probably the sorts of things you'd have to take into account, I imagine.
So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. He has got more NATO presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
We're not a pro-Russia channel. This organisation is not pro-Russia. I'm sure that were we doing this in Russia, we would experience a lot more censorship, although, hey, who's to say, huh? But what we are saying is that everything this man is inventorying here seem like unwise moves from a diplomatic perspective if the intention was to have a harmonious relationship with Russia, to acknowledge that Russia have their own sovereignty, have their own nation, have their own history, have their own trajectory. This seems like, well, hold on a minute, aren't you like provoking a nuclear superpower for reasons, again, that don't seem that clear, because he's not at any point going, and of course we have to have all these countries as members of NATO in order what? What happens? Is it going to help global warming?
And he has also seen that Finland has already joined the alliance, and Sweden will soon be a full member.
Also, we have plans to put cellophane over Vladimir Putin's toilet so when he go pee-pee, it splashes all over him. I got one of these puzzle things. Stop provoking Vladimir Putin. Some of us don't want the world to be destroyed.
This is good for the Nordic countries, it's good for Finland and Sweden, and it's also good for NATO, and it demonstrates that when President Putin invaded a European country to prevent more NATO, he's getting the exact opposite.
Brilliant. And now we've got a massive war in which 500,000 people have been killed. Let's have a look at Jeffrey Sachs' perspective so we can understand this with a little more detail. How do we get into this war and how do we get out of it? During the disastrous Vietnam War, it was said that the US government treated the public like a mushroom farm, keeping it in the dark and feeding it with manure. The heroic Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon papers documenting the unrelenting US government lying about the war in order to protect politicians who would be embarrassed by the truth. A half-century later, during the Ukraine war, the manure is piled even higher. According to the US government and the ever-obsequious New York Times, the Ukraine war was unprovoked, the Times' favourite adjective to describe the war. That is continually what you are told. If you only watch the mainstream media, if you only read the New York Times and someone said to you, what's this war about? Well, it was an unprovoked attack. People don't do unprovoked attacks. People do provoked attacks. That's what this is. This was provoked. In fact, we've just heard NATO. This is not Russian propaganda. This is NATO saying, well, Putin said that if we kept expanding NATO, there would be a war. And so we just kept expanding NATO, which seems to me to be an extraordinary decision for an unelected body funded somewhat by your nation and my nation to have made on my behalf. I don't remember being asked whether I wanted to provoke Russia into a war. Do you remember being asked? Whose agenda is being fulfilled? Why is it not being responsibly reported on? What kind of cultural curation is taking place that certain ideas are just not allowed to be in the space of public communication? Why is it that the media continue to be so obedient to an agenda that plainly is bringing us to the edge of an extremely dangerous situation? Let me know in the chat. Let me know in the comments. If you're watching us on YouTube, you 6.6 million Awakening Wonders, we're only putting half the video up here for reasons that are surely obvious to you. The majority of the content will be up on Rumble. If you're watching us on Twitter or X, Elon, thank you, we appreciate you, but we will be doing the rest of the content on Rumble because that is our home and that's where we're looked after. Putin, allegedly mistaken himself for Peter the Great, invaded Ukraine to recreate the Russian Empire. Yet last week, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg committed a Washington gaffe, meaning that he accidentally blurted out the truth. This is what a gaffe means these days, an inability to sustain the deceptive narrative that controls the public sphere, that controls the augmented reality that we're invited to live in. This is why independent media is under threat, because we can say, hey, look at this thing, NATO said that. Does that help you to draw a different conclusion? Hey, have you listened to Jeffrey Sachs? He's not a whack job. He's a university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. They have a different perspective. That's why these things are challenging. That's why it's important to stay with us. In testimony to the European Union Parliament, Stoltenberg made clear that it was America's relentless push to enlarge NATO to Ukraine that was the real cause of the war and why it continues today. Here are Stoltenberg's revealing words. Again, the background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That's what he sent us and was a precondition to not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. Well done you, because now Ukraine is being devastated, 500,000 people are dead, and the situation shows no sign of improving, and actually no one at all benefits from it except for the military-industrial complex and centralist authoritarian systems that want us to be in a perpetual state of fear and unable to question authority in our own lives because we're terrified of of continual pandemics and what? No, some people do benefit. Thanks for this. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign that promise, never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO. All the Central and Eastern Europe, we should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of B or second class membership. We rejected that. Can you see why a figure like Donald Trump, who says we'd withdraw from NATO or we'd stop funding NATO, is a kind of wrecking ball to globalist infrastructure?
Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined.
Because this is the kind of thing that can continue unquestioned. Like, when in your life do you have time to go, hey, I'm not sure if we should be supporting NATO anymore? You're being overcharged for your energy, you're being overcharged for your food, you're working too hard, you're living in a nihilistic culture that has no vision for improvement, you're living amongst fracture, fissure, thrashed around by bad ideas and bad lies most of the time. When are you ever going to be able to say, hey, is there an alternative way of living? Do we need NATO? Are the WHO actually helpful? How are they funded? Where's all this information coming from? Is there the ability to post counter narratives? You've not got time for that, have you? Well, we're going to have to make time, because it seems to me that we're on the precipice of some pretty significant changes. But what we're moving to is a technological dictatorship where there is the ability to shut down your money, shut down your life, unperson you if you even dare to question the trajectory of global or national events. Or if you want to have a conversation, if you want to have cultural differences, you are going to be able to be eliminated. This seems to me to be the terrain that they're trying to create. And organisations like NATO, WHO, I'm not saying they're entirely malign or malevolent or were created even for the wrong reasons. I'm saying that now the way they're operating is certainly beyond the remit of democracy, and you're funding for it and you're not voting for it. That's the opposite of democracy. So he went to war to prevent NATO. More NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. I mean, stop provoking Vladimir Putin in the middle of a war. Do you remember when Tucker said that within a year we'll have a hot war with Russia? Does that seem more or less likely? Let me know in the chat right now. To repeat, he, Putin, went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders. When Professor John Mearsheimer and I, and others have said the same, we've been attacked as Putin apologists. So at this point, this is sort of, I suppose, where we get into a degree of complexity. In this video, we're not saying to you, Russia are really great and NATO are bad, even though I can feel myself getting agitated on behalf of sort of the concept of Russia by the bureaucratic disingenuity of this unelected administrative official. But actually what Sachs is saying, and what he's saying his colleague Mearsheimer are saying, is we told you this and we were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Now think about the last couple of years. How many times have things been said that are true that you're dismissed as a conspiracy theorist for believing? Think of all of the major world events, the pandemic. I mean, the litany, it just goes on and on. What is happening in conjunction with very significant geopolitical moves in order, I believe, to create a unipolar globalist world where democracy and sovereignty and community are completely eroded, is the inability even to challenge on any individual issue. Dissenting voices shut down, alternative voices annihilated. The same critics also choose to hide or flatly ignore the dire warnings against NATO enlargement to Ukraine, long articulated by many of America's leading diplomats, including the great scholar-statesman George Kennan and the former US ambassadors to Russia, Jack Matlock and William Burns. So it's not all crackpots and whack jobs and people on the internet that are hippies with an axe to grind that believe in community and autonomy and democracy and that love is the answer and you have to find God within yourself, find God now. It's like actual diplomats and people that, broadly speaking, are in the general ebb and flow of international geopolitical discourse. So it's like Willie Nelson and Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix have decided that we're being lied to. It's like Jack Matlock and William Burns and George Kennan, like sort of dudes in suits in oak-panelled rooms. This is a really dangerous and unprecedented time. Let me know if you agree. Burns, now CIA director, was US ambassador to Russia in 2008 and author of a memo entitled Niet Means Niet. In that memo, Burns explained to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that the entire Russian political class, not just Putin, was dead set against NATO enlargement. We know about the memo only because it was leaked. Otherwise, we'd be in the dark about it. How many other things do we simply never have revealed to us? How much is clandestine? What do you imagine is behind those walls and doors of secrecy that they claim are there to protect us from terrorists? It's just more information that you go, oh man, we can't trust this lot. Start dismantling NATO. Get rid of that. Just completely radically reevaluate all of our democratic systems to first and foremost disable these gargantuan monoliths of horror that are guiding us gently to Armageddon. Let's get rid of them straight away. That's what you would understand if you were to have access to those classified documents, isn't it? Oh no, these classified documents. It was a surprise birthday party and you spoiled it. Remember them days, guys? Why does Russia oppose NATO enlargement? Yeah, why is that? For the simple reason that Russia does not accept the US military on its 2,300 kilometre border with Ukraine in the Black Sea region. Russia does not appreciate the US placement of Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania after the US unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Oh, it's abandoned that. How about a treaty? No missiles. How about fuck your treaty? Russia also does not welcome the fact that the US engaged in no fewer than 70 regime change operations during the Cold War between 1947 and 1989. That regime change was a surprise for your birthday. They've got a country and an institution in the shape of NATO on their borders, armed, who they know have engaged in regime change 70 times since the last war. They know that they are explicitly their enemy, and they're saying, do you mind not doing that? I mean, it essentially amounts to a polite request, eventually followed by a war. I know there's a deep and troubling history between Russia and Ukraine that I'm plainly not an expert in. What this is about is, why don't the media simply report accurately on this subject? And I can answer my own rhetorical question, because if they did, you'd make up your own mind. And when you make up your own mind, you will be less compliant and less obedient, and they cannot have that. And countless more since, including in Serbia, Afghanistan, Georgia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Venezuela, and Ukraine. Yeah, but we're not going to do any more. Nor does Russia like the fact that many leading US politicians actively advocate the destruction of Russia under the banner of decolonizing Russia. That would be like Russia calling for the removal of Texas, California, Hawaii, and conquered Indian lands, and much else from the United States. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine that Hawaii, with good reason these days, said, do you know what? The United States haven't been incredibly helpful to us. They're just using us as a missile base. When we actually need them, they give us derisory payments while they send incredible sums elsewhere, apparently to support a war that it seems like they, to some considerable degree, participated in the provocation of. And imagine if Texas took their oil. What's the benefit of the United States? Who benefits? Start asking yourself that question. Love America. Love your history. Love your nation. Love your traditions. Love your forefathers and your foremothers. But who benefits from there being one centralized government that plainly operates in the service of military-industrial complex, big pharma, uses the legacy media to whitewash and bleach the cultural space free of independent thought and independent conversation? Are you benefiting? Is it helping your energy bills? Is it helping your food bills? Is it helping your freedom? Is it helping your children's education? Is it helping your family's health? You let me know in the comments. Now, if you're watching this anywhere but Rumble, you have to click the link in the description and join us on Rumble to see this content in its entirety. If it's within your means, become a supporter, become a member of our Awakened Wonder community. That way you will guarantee that you can retain access to all of our content. In fact, there's quite a lot of content that you get access to that we simply can't give you for reasons that you now understand. More important than any of that though, if you can, please stay free.